The county gave me a work order for Tower 14 on August 6th. I remember the date because it was my daughter's birthday, and I'd promised her I'd be home by 5. And when I saw the location code on the ticket, I knew I wouldn't make it. The tower was 47 miles east of Lufkin, on a wildlife management area the county shared jurisdiction over with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And the last 12 miles were unpaved. Even without stopping to work, the drive alone would eat most of my afternoon. I was a communications technician for Angelina County. Had been for 11 years. My job was maintaining the radio infrastructure that kept the Sheriff's Department, EMS, volunteer fire departments, and county road crews connected across about 800 square miles of East Texas pine country. Repeater sites, base stations, antenna systems, backup power, the occasional public address installation at a county building. It was not glamorous work. Most weeks I drove between sites checking batteries, replacing surge protectors, tightening coax connections that weather and woodpeckers had loosened, and logging signal strength numbers into a spreadsheet that I suspected nobody besides me ever opened. Tower 14 was one of our more remote repeater mounts. The actual fire tower had been built by the CCC in the late 1930s. A 100-foot steel lattice frame with a 7x7 cab on top, sitting on a low sandy ridge surrounded by loblolly pine in every direction. The Texas Forest Service had decommissioned it in the early 70s when they shifted to aerial fire detection, and it had passed through a couple of jurisdictional handoffs before ending up as a shared asset. Parks and Wildlife used the ground-level equipment shed for seasonal storage. The county used the tower itself as an antenna mount for a VHF repeater that covered a dead zone along the Angelina-Sabine County line. There was an access road, a small gravel clearing, the shed, and the tower. That was it. The work order said the repeater had been dropping intermittently for 3 weeks. Dispatch had logged 9 outages, each lasting between 40 minutes and 6 hours, all occurring between sundown and about 4 in the morning. The pattern was unusual. Repeater failures are common enough in East Texas. Heat cooks the electronics. Humidity corrodes connectors. Pine sap gets into everything, but they don't typically follow a clock. A thermal shutdown happens when ambient temperature peaks, which in August means mid-afternoon, not midnight. A power issue from a failing solar charge controller might correlate loosely with the day-night cycle. But those failures are gradual. They don't produce a hard dropout at 8:47 p.m. and a clean recovery at 2:13 a.m. I pulled the outage log before I left the office and studied the timestamps. 9 failures over 21 days. The first 4 were short under an hour each. The next 3 were longer, closer to 3 hours. The last 2 had each lasted almost 6 hours. Whatever was happening was either getting worse or becoming more frequent, or both. The dropout times were not identical each night, but they clustered. Every single one started within 90 minutes of sunset, and every single one resolved before dawn. On 5 of the 9 nights, the repeater came back online between 1:45 and 2:30 a.m. If you work with people who depend on remote communications infrastructure, you know what that kind of gap means. Every night, the Sabine County line lost repeater coverage. Any deputy, paramedic, or fire volunteer working that corridor was on simplex radio-to-radio, line of sight only. In flat pine country with 60-foot trees in every direction, simplex range drops to almost nothing. A volunteer firefighter trying to call for backup from a structure fire on a county road out there might as well be shouting. My supervisor, Dale Ryman, handed me the work order with an expression I didn't read correctly at the time. He told me the county had been trying to address the outages for 3 weeks by sending a ranger from the wildlife management area to sit in the equipment shed overnight and report when the dropout occurred. The idea was that a person on site could observe what was physically happening to the equipment at the moment of failure, whether the repeater's power LED went dark, whether the antenna connection failed, whether something external was interfering. Simple diagnostic thinking. Send a human to watch the machine. 3 Rangers had been sent on 3 separate nights. All 3 had radioed in at the start of their shift. All 3 had left before sunrise. 2 of them had driven out before midnight. The third lasted until about 3 in the morning. None of the 3 had provided a useful equipment report. Their after-action notes, which I later read in the county's shared drive, were short and vague. Ranger 1 wrote that the repeater appeared to be functioning normally during his observation period, and that he'd left due to a personal matter. Ranger 2 wrote that he had been unable to complete the overnight observation due to a vehicle issue and recommended scheduling a daytime diagnostic instead. Ranger 3, a woman named Carla Dominguez, who I later learned had 12 years with Parks and Wildlife, wrote a single line. Equipment appeared operational. Conditions not suitable for continued observation. Recommend remote monitoring solution. Dale told me all of this with the careful neutrality of a man delivering information he did not intend to interpret for me. When I asked him what conditions not suitable meant, he said he didn't know, and that Carla Dominguez had transferred her request to a different management area the following week. He said it without emphasis, but he held eye contact a beat longer than usual, and Dale was not a man who wasted eye contact. I told him I'd drive out that afternoon, run a full diagnostic on the repeater and the power system, and determine whether an overnight observation was actually necessary or whether I could identify the failure mode from the equipment data alone. He said that sounded reasonable. Then he told me to bring a sleeping bag. If you're the kind of person who stays up late listening to stories about strange things in remote places, you might find this one worth your time. Ashwarden horror is where these accounts end up. And if that interests you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. I left the office at noon and stopped at the Brookshire Brothers in Lufkin for water, a sandwich, a bag of peanuts, and a 6-pack of Dr. Pepper. I called my wife and told her I'd probably be back by mid-morning the next day. She asked what was out there. I said a radio tower and some pine trees. She said happy birthday to Lily from both of us and hung up. We'd been married long enough that an overnight field call didn't require much negotiation. The drive east on 103 was familiar. I'd serviced the Tower 14 repeater twice in the previous 2 years, both times during the day, both times for routine maintenance. Once to replace a duplexer that had gone intermittent. Once to swap out a solar charge controller. Normal jobs. The tower was unremarkable. If anything, it was one of the easier sites. No locked Forest Service gates. No cattle guards with rusted hinges. No wasp nests in the equipment cabinet. Just a long drive. The last 12 miles, once I turned off the farm to Market Road onto the management area's gravel access route, took about 35 minutes. The road was in fair shape, some washboarding, a few soft sandy spots, one low-water crossing over a creek that was barely a trickle in August. The pine plantation on either side of the road was dense and even-aged, probably a commercial loblolly stand that Parks and Wildlife had acquired or assumed management of at some point. The trees were maybe 40 years old, thick enough to block any view beyond the road shoulder, spaced close enough that the understory was mostly brown needle duff and a thin scatter of Yalpan holly. It wasn't wild country exactly. It was managed land that happened to be a long way from anything. I reached the tower clearing at about 1:45 in the afternoon. 93 degrees, light wind out of the south, the kind of humid East Texas heat that makes your shirt stick to the truck seat the moment you step out. The clearing was maybe 60 feet across gravel and sandy soil. The equipment shed on the north side, The tower base centered in the clearing with guy wires running to 3 concrete anchors. The cab at the top of the tower was original steel frame, glass on all 4 sides, a catwalk around the perimeter. You could see the antenna and the small equipment enclosure I'd bolted to the catwalk railing 2 years earlier. I started with the ground level work. The equipment shed was a prefabricated metal building, maybe 10 by 12, with a padlocked door. I had the key. Inside, 2 plastic storage bins belonging to Parks and Wildlife, a folding table, a metal chair, a small window-mounted air conditioning unit that was unplugged, and the repeater's battery bank and charge controller on a plywood shelf along the back wall. I powered up my laptop, connected to the charge controller's data port, and pulled the logs. The charge controller told a straightforward story. The solar panels were producing normal current during the day. The battery bank was holding charge. The voltage curve overnight was smooth and well within operating range. At no point in the last 3 weeks had the battery voltage dropped below 12.4 volts, which was nowhere near the repeater's low voltage shutdown threshold. The power system was not the problem. I checked the physical connections in the shed coax to the feed line running up the tower, power cables, grounding. Everything was tight. No corrosion, no damage, no signs of rodent chewing. I plugged in the AC unit, let it run for 15 minutes to bring the shed temperature down, and then drove my truck to the base of the tower and started climbing. I should mention that I'm not particularly fond of heights. I'm functional with them, the job requires it, but I don't enjoy tower climbs the way some techs do. Tower 14 was 100 feet, which is moderate. I wore my harness, clipped in at every transition, and took my time. The lattice structure vibrated slightly in the wind, and the rungs were hot enough through my gloves that I could feel each one. At the top, the catwalk was a narrow steel grating that flexed when I stepped onto it. The cab door was latched, but not locked. I opened it and looked inside. The cab was mostly empty. The original Osborne fire finder had been removed decades ago. All that remained was the mounting pedestal in the center of the floor and some bolts. The windows were intact, but filthy. Someone had left a plastic milk crate in one corner, and there was an old folding camp chair leaning against the wall. The floor was steel with a few patches of surface rust. It smelled like hot metal and pine resin. Nothing unusual. I walked the catwalk to the equipment enclosure I'd installed. The repeater was housed in a NEMA-rated weather box bolted to the railing, with the antenna mounted on a short mast above it. I opened the enclosure. The repeater was powered on, LEDs normal, a faint hum from the fan. I connected my analyzer to the antenna port and swept the frequency. The forward power was good. The reflected power was acceptable. The antenna system was working. I ran a full diagnostic cycle on the repeater itself. Transmit test, receive sensitivity, squelch calibration, CTCSS tone verification. Everything passed. Standing on that catwalk in the August heat with sweat dripping off my nose onto the analyzer screen, I could not find a single thing wrong with the system. That bothered me more than a clear failure would have. A dead component I can replace. A corroded connector I can clean. A system that tests perfectly in the afternoon but drops dead at night for 6 hours at a stretch suggests a problem that only exists under conditions I haven't replicated. Temperature differential, moisture condensation after sundown, RF interference from a source that's only active at night. Something. I climbed back down, returned to the shed, and set up what I thought of as a trap. I connected a logging power meter in line with the repeater's coax feed, configured it to record signal levels every 30 seconds through the night. I set up a small battery-powered spectrum analyzer to capture any RF interference in the repeater's frequency range. I plugged in a temperature and humidity logger inside the equipment enclosure and another one inside the shed. If the repeater dropped overnight, I wanted to know exactly what every measurable parameter was doing at the moment it happened. Then I sat in the metal chair in the shed and ate my sandwich. The shed faced east. Through the open door I could see the tree line, the road disappearing into the pines, and a strip of sky above the canopy that was already beginning to lose its blue. It was about 5:30. Sunset would be around 8:15. I had time. I called my daughter from the truck. The cell signal was marginal 1 bar that occasionally flickered to 2, but the call connected. She was happy about her presence. She asked where I was. I told her I was at a tower in the woods. She asked if it was a castle tower or a boring tower. I told her it was the boring kind. She said she hoped I wouldn't be too bored. I told her I loved her and I'd be home tomorrow. Then I walked around the clearing, not looking for anything in particular. This is something I do at remote sites. When I have time, just walk the perimeter, look at the infrastructure, check the guy wire anchors, see if anything has changed since my last visit. The 3 concrete anchors were solid. The guy wires were tensioned properly. The gravel clearing had some tire ruts from the Rangers' vehicles, but nothing unusual. The tree line was about 30 feet from the tower base, in every direction, a ring of loblolly pines, dense and uniform, their crowns interlocking overhead to form a ragged ceiling. I noticed one thing during that walk that I filed away without much thought. Along the south edge of the clearing, maybe 6 feet inside the tree line, there was a strip of ground about 20 feet long where the pine needle duff had been pushed aside. Not raked pushed, as though something had been dragged across the ground in a broad, sweeping motion. Underneath the displaced needles, the sandy soil was exposed, and it was darker than I expected. Not wet exactly, but dark, as though it had been stained. I assumed an animal had been dragging something, a deer carcass maybe, or a feral hog rooting in a straight line, which they sometimes do. I didn't photograph it. I didn't measure it. I stepped over it and continued my walk. By 7:30, the light was going amber. I moved my truck closer to the shed, oriented it so the headlights faced the clearing, and left the keys in the ignition in case I needed light in a hurry. I brought my sleeping bag, a headlamp, my phone, and the handheld radio I carry for monitoring into the shed. I plugged the AC unit back in. It rattled and dripped, but it cooled the air enough to make the shed tolerable. I want to be clear about my state of mind at this point. I was not anxious. I was not thinking about why the Rangers had left. I was thinking about the diagnostic data I'd collect overnight, and whether it would show me something my daytime tests couldn't. That was the job. The Rangers were not technical people. They'd been sent to babysit equipment they didn't understand, in a place that was admittedly remote and dark and not comfortable. I assumed they'd gotten bored or spooked by normal wood sounds, or simply decided that sitting alone in a metal shed in the middle of East Texas pine country from dusk to dawn wasn't worth whatever they were being paid. I did not judge them for that. I also did not take their departure seriously as a data point. At 8:11, 4 minutes before official sunset, I was sitting in the metal chair with the shed door open, drinking a Dr. Pepper and watching the spectrum analyzer's waterfall display on my laptop screen. The repeater was operating normally. The RF environment was quiet, just the repeater's own signal and the faint traces of distant commercial stations. The temperature inside the equipment enclosure on the tower had dropped 2 degrees from its afternoon peak. Humidity was climbing, as expected. At 8:23, 8 minutes after sunset, the spectrum analyzer registered something I hadn't seen during the afternoon. A brief broadband pulse across a wide frequency range, lasting about 2 seconds. It wasn't on the repeater's frequency specifically. It splashed across everything from about 140 to 160 megahertz. Then it was gone. I sat up and watched the waterfall. The display scrolled. Nothing. I waited. 2 minutes later, another pulse. Same bandwidth, same duration, same apparent intensity. Then nothing for 4 minutes. Then another. I checked the repeater. Still operational. The pulses weren't strong enough to desensitize the receiver. They were there. They were real. They were measurable. But they weren't doing anything to the equipment yet. I leaned back and thought about what could produce a broadband RF pulse in the middle of an East Texas pine plantation at sundown. An electric fence charger was the first thought. Livestock fences produce regular timed pulses that can splatter across RF bands. But there was no livestock operation adjacent to the management area. And the pulses weren't regular. They were spaced unevenly: 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 1 minute, 3 minutes. An electric fence charger fires once per second, every second. This wasn't that. Ignition noise from a vehicle? Possible, but I couldn't hear an engine, and the road was the only approach. A failing power line insulator could arc and produce broadband noise. But the nearest power line was 7 miles away, and the pulses were too strong and too clean for distant line noise. I considered atmospheric static from convective activity. But the sky had been clear all day, and I'd heard no thunder. At 8:41, the pulses stopped. The waterfall went quiet. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Nothing. The repeater was fine. The RF environment was clean. I wrote the time and my observations in my notebook and considered the possibility that I just witnessed whatever was causing the outages. Some sort of intermittent RF interference source that was strong enough at closer range or under slightly different conditions to overwhelm the repeater's front end. If the source was mobile or variable, that would explain why it sometimes caused a dropout and sometimes didn't. I was almost satisfied with that explanation when, at 9:07, the repeater dropped. It didn't fade. It switched off. One moment the power meter showed normal forward power on the coax line. The next moment, 0. I checked the shed equipment. The charge controller was fine. Battery voltage was 12.8 volts, all connections tight. The repeater itself had simply stopped transmitting. Its power LED was still on. Its display showed no error. It was receiving power. It just wasn't working. I cycled the repeater off and on. It came back immediately, full power, full function. I watched it for 30 seconds. Normal. I sat back down. At 9:11 it dropped again. Same behavior. Power present, no error, no output. I cycled it again. It came back. At 9:14, it dropped. This cycle repeated 4 more times over the next 20 minutes. Each time, the repeater appeared to be functioning powered, no faults, but produced no RF output. Each time, a power cycle restored it for a shorter period. By 9:34, it was dropping within seconds of being restored. I stopped cycling it and let it sit in its failed state. The spectrum analyzer showed nothing during these dropouts. No broadband pulses, no interference. The RF environment was quieter than it had been all day. The repeater wasn't being jammed or overloaded. It was simply refusing to transmit, as though some internal component had decided to stop cooperating. I've worked on radio equipment for 11 years. I've seen components fail in strange ways. Heat-sensitive capacitors, cold-sensitive oscillators, firmware bugs that trigger under specific and absurd conditions. But I'd never seen a repeater that passed every diagnostic test, showed no fault codes, maintained power, and simply declined to transmit. The failure mode didn't match anything in my experience. I was writing this in my notebook when I heard something outside the shed. It was not a dramatic sound. It wasn't a growl or a scream or a branch breaking. It was a scraping sound. Slow, broad, continuous, like something heavy and flat being dragged across sandy ground. It lasted about 4 seconds and then stopped. It came from the south side of the clearing, the side where I'd seen the displaced pine needles that afternoon. I turned off my headlamp and listened. Crickets. The AC unit rattling. A very distant coyote, so far away it was more of a suggestion than a sound. I waited a full minute, nothing else. I turned the headlamp back on, picked up my flashlight, and walked to the shed door. The clearing was dark. My truck was a shape to my left, the tower a lattice shadow against a sky that still held a faint orange line at the western horizon. I turned on the flashlight and swept it across the south tree line. The strip of displaced pine needles I'd seen that afternoon had grown. It was wider now, maybe 3 feet across instead of 1. And it extended further in both directions. The exposed soil underneath was darker than it had been. And at the near end of the strip, closest to the clearing, the soil wasn't just exposed, it was mounded. A low ridge of dark sand, maybe 4 inches high, pushed up as though something underneath had moved forward and displaced the ground above it. I stood there with the flashlight and looked at it, and tried very hard to think of an animal that pushes soil in a flat, broad strip, in a straight line, toward a clearing, at night, in August, in East Texas. I didn't have one. I went back inside the shed and closed the door. Not because I was afraid I want to be precise about this, but because I wanted to check the equipment data before I investigated further. I sat down and opened the temperature log from the equipment enclosure on the tower. The external temperature had dropped from 93 degrees at my arrival to 81 degrees at the time of the first broadband pulse. Normal. But the log also showed something I hadn't configured it to capture. The internal temperature of the repeater's chassis, which the unit reports passively through its data port. At 8:23, the moment of the first pulse, the repeater's internal temperature had jumped 4 degrees in under 2 seconds. By 8:41, when the pulses stopped, it had returned to its expected value. At 9:07, when the repeater dropped, the internal temperature had climbed again, this time by 9 degrees, and stayed elevated. A 9-degree thermal spike in a device that was not under load, sitting in a cooling nighttime environment, drawing the same power it had drawn all day, with no change in airflow or enclosure conditions. That does not happen. I sat in the shed and stared at the number on my laptop screen and listened to the AC unit rattle and understood, clearly and for the first time, that the problem at Tower 14 was not an equipment failure. The equipment was responding to something. The 3 rangers who had come here on 3 separate nights and left before sunrise had not been spooked by the dark or bored by the assignment. They had been sitting in this shed, or near it, and they had perceived something that their reports carefully did not describe. And I was now sitting in the same shed, on the 4th attempt, with better instruments and worse company, at 9:47 on a Tuesday night in August. And the repeater was dead, and the soil outside was moving, and the only logical step was to climb the tower and check the equipment enclosure in person. I did not want to climb the tower. I did not want to climb the tower at night, in the dark, alone, with something happening to the ground at the edge of the clearing that I could not explain. But I had come here to diagnose an equipment failure. And the data was telling me that the failure was accompanied by a thermal anomaly in the enclosure. And if something was physically wrong inside that box, a short, an arc, a component in thermal runaway, then I needed to see it before it caused a fire on a 100-foot steel tower in the middle of a pine forest in August. So I put on my harness, clipped my flashlight to my chest strap, and walked to the base of the tower. The clearing was still. The air had cooled just enough to feel different from the daytime heat, not cool, exactly, but less aggressive. The flashlight beam caught the tower's lattice in silver slices as I approached. I put my hands on the first rung. It was warm, not hot from the day's absorbed heat, which would have dissipated by now. Warm the way a pipe is warm when fluid is moving through it. A gentle, distributed warmth that I could feel through my gloves. I held the rung and waited. The warmth was steady, not pulsing, not increasing, just present, as though the steel itself was carrying a low-grade thermal load from a source I could not identify. I climbed. Slowly, clipping in at every section, testing each rung before committing my weight, trying to pay attention to the steel under my hands. The warmth did not increase as I ascended. If anything, it was more noticeable at the lower sections, as though whatever was producing it was coming from below, from the ground, traveling up through the tower's foundation bolts and into the lattice frame. At 60 feet, I stopped to rest and looked down. My flashlight was chest-mounted and pointed upward, so the clearing below was lit only by the ambient glow of my truck's parking lights, which I'd left on. I could see the pale oval of gravel, the dark rectangle of the shed, the tree line, and I could see, at the south edge of the clearing, that the strip of dark soil had reached the gravel. It was no longer inside the tree line. It extended into the clearing by at least 6 feet. And it was wider than before, 5 or 6 feet across now. A dark tongue of displaced earth advancing toward the base of the tower. I was 60 feet up a steel lattice structure, alone, looking down at ground that was visibly different from how it had appeared 40 minutes earlier. I finished the climb. Part 2. The catwalk grating rang under my boots. I steadied myself against the railing and took a breath. The air at 100 feet was different, not cooler, but less enclosed. A faint movement from the south that carried the mineral smell of dry pine bark and something else. Something I didn't have a comparison for at the time. Not rot, not sulfur, not ozone. A flat, clean, mineral scent, like the smell of river gravel when you turn it over on a dry day. I noticed it and let it go. I moved around the catwalk to the equipment enclosure. The weather box was latched. I unclipped my flashlight and held it in my teeth while I opened the enclosure. The repeater sat in its rack mount, power LED solid green, display cycling through its normal status screens. Fan spinning. No visible damage, no scorch marks, no melted insulation, no signs of arcing. I touched the chassis with the back of my hand. It was hot, not dangerously hot, maybe 120, 130 degrees, but far hotter than it should have been for a device that was drawing normal current in an open-air enclosure at night. A repeater under full transmit load in a sealed cabinet on an August afternoon might reach those temperatures. A repeater sitting idle in an ambient environment of 80 degrees with a functioning fan should not. I opened the data port and connected my handheld diagnostic unit. The repeater's internal log confirmed what the remote temperature data had shown. A sustained thermal anomaly beginning at 9:07 and holding steady. But the log also showed something the remote data hadn't captured. The repeater's receive sensitivity had shifted. The unit was still technically receiving, but its noise floor had risen by roughly 18 decibels, as though the entire RF environment around the antenna had become saturated with energy that the spectrum analyzer on the ground, 50 feet of coax away, was not detecting. That made no sense. The analyzer was reading the same antenna through the same feed line. If the antenna was receiving elevated noise, the analyzer should see it. Unless the noise was entering the system somewhere between the antenna and the point where the analyzer was tapped into the coax, which would mean something was coupling into the feed line itself, or into the enclosure, or into the tower structure that the enclosure was mounted on. I put my hand on the railing. Warm. The same steady, low warmth I'd felt on the rungs during the climb. I moved my hand to the catwalk grating. Warm. I knelt and placed my palm flat on the cab floor. Warmer. The steel at the top of the tower was carrying more heat than the steel at the bottom, which was the inverse of what passive thermal radiation from the ground should produce. If the earth below was warm, the heat would conduct upward through the legs and dissipate before it reached the cab. For the cab to be warmer than the base, the energy had to be entering the structure near the top, or the structure itself was acting as some kind of collector, concentrating energy from its surroundings at its highest point. I stood up and looked out through the cab windows. From 100 feet, the East Texas pine country at night is a flat, dark blanket extending to every horizon. No lights, no towns. The nearest farmhouse was 7 miles west. The sky was clear, thick with stars, the Milky Way a pale smear running roughly north-south. I turned off my flashlight to let my eyes adjust. It took about 2 minutes. The tree canopy below resolved into a textured surface, darker than the sky, and the clearing around the tower base became a faint gray interruption in the dark. I could see my truck's parking lights, 2 small amber points. I could see the shed as a dark rectangle, and I could see the ground. The strip of dark soil I'd been tracking was no longer a strip. From 100 feet up, looking down at an angle through the open cab window, I could see that the displaced earth now formed a rough semicircle extending from the south tree line into the clearing. It covered maybe a quarter of the clearing's visible area. The leading edge, if that's the right word, had reached the nearest tower leg. I checked my watch. 10:14 p.m. I had been on the ground at 9:50 when I started climbing. In 24 minutes, the disturbance had covered another 10 or 12 feet. I want to describe what I did next accurately because I think it matters. I did not panic. I did not scramble for the ladder. I sat down on the cab floor, which was warm against my legs, and I took out my notebook. And I wrote down everything I'd observed since arriving at the tower. The timestamps, the RF data, the thermal readings, the repeater behavior, the soil displacement at the tree line at 5:30, at the tree line at 9:47, at the clearing edge at 10:14. I wrote it as a field report, the same way I document any anomaly at any site. What I observed, when I observed it, what instruments recorded, what I could not explain. I did this because I understood that if I climbed down and drove away, which every non-professional part of me was now suggesting, the only record of what was happening at Tower 14 would be as vague and useless as the 3 ranger reports that preceded mine. And I had not driven 47 miles and climbed 100 feet to produce a report that said, "Conditions not suitable for continued observation." I stayed in the cab. Between 10:14 and 10:45, I made observations at roughly 5-minute intervals by looking through the cab windows. The dark semicircle of displaced soil continued to expand. It did not move in sudden lurches. It advanced the way spilled water advances across a tile floor, a slow, steady, broad front that was almost impossible to perceive in real time, but measurably different each time I checked. By 10:45, it had covered the nearest tower leg and extended past the base of the tower toward the north side of the clearing. The warmth in the tower structure had increased. Not dramatically, but enough to be uncomfortable against my palms when I touched the floor. I estimated the steel surface at 105, maybe 110 degrees. The air inside the cab had also warmed, though the ambient temperature outside should have been dropping. I took a reading from the temperature logger I'd clipped to my belt. 91 degrees at 100 feet above grade at 10:45 p.m. The ground-level afternoon temperature had been 93. Nighttime temperature at elevation should have been somewhere in the low 80s. The cab was 10 degrees warmer than it should have been. At 10:52, I heard the sound again, the broad scraping. But from 100 feet up, it didn't sound like scraping. It sounded like something breathing very slowly through a very large throat. A long, drawn inhalation that lasted 8 or 9 seconds, followed by silence, followed by another. It came from below, from the ground, from the direction of the expanding disturbance. I counted 6 of these cycles before they stopped. I am not a person who uses metaphor loosely. I am an electronics technician. I deal in signals and measurements. But I sat in that cab and listened to the ground breathe. And I did not have a measurement for it. I had the spectrum analyzer in the shed below. I had the thermal data on my diagnostic unit. I had the repeater's log. What I did not have was any framework for connecting a broadband RF pulse, a thermal anomaly in a steel structure, a repeater failure, a soil disturbance advancing in real time, and an audible, rhythmic exhalation from the earth. At 11:20, I made a decision that I've questioned many times since. I decided to climb down. Not to leave to retrieve the spectrum analyzer from the shed and bring it up to the cab so I could capture whatever the antenna was receiving at the point of entry, above the feed line, above any coupling artifacts. If the repeater was seeing 18 decibels of elevated noise, I wanted to see it from the antenna's perspective. The climb down was different from the climb up. The rungs were warm enough now that I could feel the heat through my gloves at every grip. The tower vibrated faintly, not from wind, which had died completely, but from something internal. A low-frequency tremor that I could feel in my sternum when I pressed my chest against the lattice to clip in at the transition points. Twice during the descent, I stopped and held still, trying to determine whether the vibration was real or whether I was shaking. I pressed my palm flat against a lattice member and held it there. The vibration was in the steel. It was consistent, and it was not my pulse. I reached the ground at 11:31. The gravel under my boots felt different. I tested it with my foot pressed down, shifted my weight. The surface was still firm, but underneath the gravel, maybe 4 or 5 inches down, the ground had a softness to it, a yielding quality like walking on sand that has recently been saturated. The clearing had been dry and hard that afternoon. I had parked a 3/4-ton truck on it without leaving ruts deeper than half an inch. I walked to the shed. The door was still closed. I opened it and went inside. The shed had changed. The temperature inside the shed had risen to what felt like over 100 degrees. The AC unit was still running, still rattling, still dripping condensation. But the air was thick and warm, and carried that flat mineral scent I'd noticed on the catwalk. Stronger now, pervasive. The spectrum analyzer on the folding table showed a waterfall display that made me stop walking. The entire band from 130 to 170 megahertz was lit, not with discrete signals or pulses, but with a continuous elevated noise floor that looked like a solid wall of energy. It had not been there when I left the shed 40 minutes earlier. The analyzer's signal level display showed the noise floor at roughly -60 decibel milliwatts, which was about 30 decibels higher than a normal rural environment. That is an enormous amount of ambient RF energy. In a city, near a cluster of commercial transmitters, You might see numbers like that. In a pine forest 47 miles from the nearest town, at 11:30 at night, with no commercial stations, no power lines, no industrial equipment, you absolutely do not. I saved the analyzer capture to the SD card. I saved the temperature logs. I disconnected the spectrum analyzer from the Coke's feed line, unplugged it, and tucked it under my arm. Then I heard the breathing again. This time, it was not coming from outside. It was coming from underneath the shed. The shed sat on a concrete slab. The slab sat on grade. There was no crawl space, no gap, no void. The building was in direct contact with the ground. And underneath it, through the concrete, through the steel floor pan, I could hear that same slow, rhythmic sound. A deep, broad inhalation, a silence, another inhalation, and I could feel it in my feet. The concrete floor was vibrating in sync with the sound. I left the shed. I did not run. I walked to my truck, put the analyzer on the passenger seat, got in, and turned on the headlights. The headlights illuminated the clearing in a wash of white light that made everything look flat and overexposed. The tower was a bright lattice skeleton. The shed was a silver rectangle. And the ground was wrong. The entire clearing, as far as the headlights reached, was dark. Not the pale gray of sandy gravel. Dark. The soil disturbance I'd been tracking from the south tree line had expanded to cover the full clearing. The gravel was still there, but it was sitting on top of dark, moist-looking earth that had risen through it, pushed between the stones, filled the gaps. It looked like the clearing was sweating. The surface was uneven, low ridges, slight depressions, a texture that had not been there when I'd walked to the tower an hour ago. I put the truck in reverse and backed it toward the access road. The tires sank slightly deeper than they should have in the gravel. Not stuck, but working. I stopped at the edge of the clearing where the gravel met the dirt road and put the truck in park, and sat there with the engine running and the headlights on, and looked at Tower 14. The tower stood in the center of the altered clearing like a pin in a cushion. The cab at the top was dark. The catwalk railing caught the headlight glare faintly. And along the base of the tower, where the 4 steel legs met the concrete foundation pad, I could see something I'd not seen before. The dark soil had not merely reached the tower. It had climbed it. A dark discoloration extended up the nearest leg to a height of about 2 feet, as though the ground had risen and then partially receded, leaving a wet-looking stain on the galvanized steel. My truck's dashboard clock read 11:48. The repeater had been down for 2 hours and 41 minutes. The broadband noise was presumably still saturating the band. The ground had transformed the entire clearing in approximately 3 hours, and the phenomenon was in contact with the tower structure, which explained the warmth, which explained the thermal spike in the repeater enclosure, which might explain the elevated noise floor, which might explain the repeater failure. I sat in my truck and thought about this chain of causation and realized that I had just done something none of the 3 rangers had done. I had collected data on every link in that chain. I had timestamps, RF captures, thermal logs, and visual observations from both ground level and the cab. I had a diagnostic narrative that connected the repeater failure to a physical event at the site. I had done my job. I could leave. I sat there for another 10 minutes, watching the clearing and the headlights. The dark soil did not visibly advance during that time. The breathing sound, if it was still happening, was inaudible over the truck engine. The air coming through the cracked window smelled like minerals and warm pine. I did not leave. I'm going to explain why. And I need you to understand that the explanation is not bravery. It is not curiosity in the adventurous sense. It is the specific, unglamorous stubbornness of a person who has been sent to do a task and has not yet completed it, because the data he has explains how the repeater fails, but does not explain what is causing the failure. I had the mechanism, I did not have the source. And I had instruments in the truck that could potentially characterize the source if I stayed long enough to use them. I also thought about something Dale Ryman had said when he handed me the work order. He hadn't told me to diagnose the repeater. He'd told me to bring a sleeping bag. He'd known I would find something that required more than an afternoon. He'd known because 3 rangers had told him something with their early departures that their written reports refused to say. And he'd sent me not another ranger, not a parks and wildlife biologist, not an engineer from the radio shop in Nacogdoches, but me, his county comtech who had worked remote sites alone for 11 years, because he wanted someone who would describe what they found in terms of measurements rather than feelings. I owed Dale a report that was worth his trust. Even if his trust had been a quiet form of using me as a sensor, he could point at a problem he didn't want to approach himself. I turned off the truck engine. I left the headlights on to preserve visibility. I took the spectrum analyzer from the passenger seat, reconnected its battery, and extended its telescoping whip antenna. I set it to scan continuously across the full VHF band and began walking slowly back toward the clearing. The ground under the gravel was softer now, but still firm enough to walk on. My boots left impressions about an inch deep. The dark soil between the gravel stones was moist to the touch. I knelt and pressed my finger into it. It was warm. Not hot, but distinctly warmer than the ambient air. I wiped my finger on my jeans and kept walking. I stopped about 15 feet from the tower base and held the analyzer at arm's length, rotating slowly through 360 degrees. The noise floor was elevated in every direction, but it was not uniform. It was strongest when the antenna pointed at the tower itself, not at the repeater enclosure on top at the tower's base, where the legs met the ground. The noise was coming from the ground, propagating into the steel and radiating from the structure like an antenna. The tower had become a transmitter. Not in any deliberate sense, there was no modulated signal, no information content that I could discern. It was broadcasting raw, broadband electromagnetic energy that the ground was feeding into it through direct physical contact. The repeater had failed because its receiver was being overwhelmed by noise radiating from the very structure it was mounted on. I took readings at 5-foot intervals along a line from the tower base toward the south tree line. The signal strength increased as I approached the tree line. It was strongest at the edge of the clearing, where the dark soil had first emerged. Inside the tree line, where the original strip of displaced needles had been, I measured a noise floor 6 decibels higher than at the tower base. Whatever was producing this energy, its source was not at the tower. The tower was an intermediary. The source was in the ground, to the south, somewhere under the pines. At 12:20 a.m., I was standing inside the tree line, 6 feet from the clearing, holding the spectrum analyzer and looking at a noise floor reading that I would have called impossible if someone had described it to me that morning. I was also standing on ground that was warm enough to feel through my boot soles, in air that smelled like heated stone, next to a strip of displaced earth that was now wide enough to be called a path. The path led south, into the pines. I did not follow it. I want to record that clearly. I stood at the edge of the tree line and pointed the analyzer south, and watched the signal strength climb as the antenna swept that bearing. And I understood that the source was out there, somewhere in the pine plantation, producing energy that was propagating through the soil and into every grounded metal structure in the area. And I made a decision that I was not going to walk into a dark pine forest at midnight, following a path that the ground itself had made. I walked back to my truck, got in, and drove it to the edge of the clearing, where I could see both the tower and the south tree line. I left the engine off and the headlights on, and sat in the cab with the analyzer on the dashboard, scanning, and my notebook in my lap, writing. At 1:15 a.m., the noise floor began to drop. It fell slowly, about 2 decibels every 10 minutes. By 2 o'clock, it was back to roughly normal levels. At 2:08, the repeater came back online. I confirmed it from the handheld radio on my belt, keyed up the repeater, got a courtesy tone, heard my own transmission come back clean. By 2:30, the warmth in the air had faded. The mineral smell was gone. I got out of the truck and walked to the clearing. The gravel was still dark, the soil between the stones still displaced, but it was no longer moist. It was drying. The surface was stiffening like mud that's been exposed to air. The dark stain on the tower leg was still visible, but it had faded to a gray smear. I drove back to Lufkin as the sky was beginning to lighten. I was at the office by 6:45. Dale was already there. He was sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee, and he looked at me when I came in and said nothing for about 5 seconds, which was the longest I had ever seen Dale Ryman go without speaking when someone entered his office. I put the spectrum analyzer, the temperature logger, and my notebook on his desk. I told him the repeater failure was caused by broadband electromagnetic interference propagating through the ground and into the tower structure. That the interference followed a predictable nocturnal cycle, that it was accompanied by physical changes to the soil in the clearing and a measurable thermal anomaly in the tower steel, and that the source appeared to be located somewhere south of the clearing inside the pine plantation. Dale listened to all of this. He picked up my notebook and read my field notes from beginning to end, turning pages slowly, reading the way he reads everything once, thoroughly, without skipping. When he finished, he closed the notebook and put it down and looked at me. "The Rangers," he said. "Carla and the other 2. Did they see the same thing?" I told him their reports didn't describe anything like what I had documented, but their behavior, the early departures, the vague language, Carla's transfer request, was consistent with people who had perceived something alarming and chosen not to put it in writing. Dale nodded. He asked me if I wanted to go back. I told him I wanted to go back during the day, with a ground-penetrating radar unit borrowed from the county road department, and survey the area south of the clearing to a depth of at least 6 feet. He told me the county didn't have a ground-penetrating radar unit. I told him I knew, but that the state DOT regional office in Lufkin had one, and that I'd worked with their survey crew on a utility locate project 2 years earlier and could probably arrange a loan. Dale was quiet for a while. Then he said something that rearranged my understanding of the assignment. "Marcus, this is the 3rd time I've sent someone out there with instruments. You're the first one who brought data back. The first 2 techs went before the Rangers. One of them was Greg Lindstrom, who retired in March. The other was a contract RF consultant out of Beaumont, who we paid $1,100 for a half-day site visit." He paused. "Greg came back and told me the site was fine and we should replace the repeater. The consultant never submitted his report. I followed up twice, and then his office stopped returning calls. I asked Dale why he hadn't told me any of this before I went. Because Greg's a good technician, and the consultant had 20 years of credentials, and neither one of them wrote down what you wrote down. If I told you they'd been spooked, you might have gone out there looking for something to be spooked by. I needed you to go out there and measure. I didn't like that. I told him so. He accepted it the way Dale accepts most criticism, which is with total stillness and a complete absence of defensiveness that somehow makes you feel worse than if he'd argued. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a folded topographic map and spread it on the desk. It was a standard USGS quad covering the area around Tower 14. He pointed to a location about half a mile south of the tower, inside the pine plantation. When the state acquired this tract in the 60s, there was a well here. Not a water well, a test bore. The Texas Railroad Commission issued a permit in 1958 for an exploratory gas well. The operator was a company out of Tyler that doesn't exist anymore. They drilled to about 4,000 feet, logged the hole, and plugged it. Or they were supposed to plug it. The plugging records are incomplete. I asked him how long he'd known about the well. Since before I sent Greg. I asked him why he hadn't included that in the work order. Because a plugged gas well from 1958 doesn't cause broadband RF interference. It doesn't make the ground warm. It doesn't make a repeater stop transmitting. He looked at me. But the well is there. And the well is south of the tower. And your data says the source is south of the tower. And I cannot make those two facts have nothing to do with each other. I went home. I slept for 4 hours. I picked Lily up from school and took her for ice cream, one day late. She told me about her birthday party. I told her about the tower. I told her it was very tall and had a little room at the top. She asked if I could see the whole world from up there. I told her you could see a lot of trees. The next morning, I made calls about the ground-penetrating radar. The state DOT crew was available but needed a formal request and a 2-week lead time. I submitted the paperwork. Then I pulled every public record I could find on the 1958 exploratory well. There wasn't much. The Railroad Commission's online database had a permit record for the well operator name, permit date, location coordinates, permitted depth of 5,000 feet, actual total depth of 4,127 feet. The completion report indicated the well had encountered no commercial gas and was classified as a dry hole. The plugging affidavit was on file but consisted of a single page with a notarized signature and a statement that the well had been plugged with cement in accordance with Commission rules. No cement volumes, no interval descriptions, no verification record. In my experience with rural infrastructure, a plugging affidavit from 1958 with no detail and no follow-up means one of two things. The well was plugged properly, and the paperwork standards of the era were simply lower, or the well was not plugged properly and no one ever checked. I went back to Tower 14 days later with the DOT survey crew. 2 technicians with a cart-mounted GPR unit. We arrived at 10 in the morning. The clearing looked normal in daylight. The gravel was dry. The dark discoloration I'd seen was gone or invisible in sunlight. The tower steel was ambient temperature. The repeater was operating normally. I did not mention the overnight events to the DOT crew. I told them I was looking for underground utilities and abandoned well bores south of the clearing. They ran the GPR on a grid pattern from the south edge of the clearing into the tree line and about 400 feet into the pine plantation. The work took 3 hours. I walked behind them and watched the radargram on their display. The results were not what I expected. The soil profile was normal sandy loam over clay typical East Texas coastal plain geology. There were no metallic anomalies, no pipe, no casing. But at a depth of about 8 feet, across a swath roughly 40 feet wide running north-south through the survey area, the GPR showed a reflector that the senior technician described as a density contrast. Not a void, not a buried object, not bedrock. A zone where the soil's dielectric properties changed abruptly, as though the material at that depth was different from the material on either side. The technician said it could be a clay lens, a paleo channel, or a variation in moisture content. He said it was unremarkable. He said things like that show up on GPR surveys all the time. I asked him if a density contrast at 8 feet could act as a waveguide for electromagnetic energy. He gave me a look that suggested I had asked a question outside his area of expertise and also outside the range of questions he considered normal. He said he didn't know. He said I should ask a geophysicist. They packed up and left. I stayed. I walked south along the bearing where the GPR had shown the density contrast and my overnight RF data had shown the strongest signal. I walked slowly through the loblolly pines, straight-trunked and evenly spaced, the needle duff soft and quiet under my boots. The plantation felt like a hallway, long, narrow sight lines between the trunks, the canopy filtering the noon sun into a warm, greenish half-light. At about a quarter mile from the clearing, I found the well. It was not dramatic. A 6-inch steel pipe protruding about 18 inches above grade, capped with a rusted steel plate that was welded on, partially buried in pine needles. A faded yellow survey stake nearby. No signage, no fencing, no indication that anyone had visited in decades. I brushed the needles off the cap and put my hand on it. It was warm, not hot, not 130 degrees like the repeater chassis. Maybe 95, 100 degrees. Warmer than the ambient air, warmer than the surrounding soil, warmer than it should have been in the shade at noon. I knelt and put my ear close to the cap without touching it. I listened for 30 seconds. I heard something. It was faint and low, more felt than heard. A sound that existed at the boundary between vibration and tone. It was rhythmic. It was slow. It was the same cadence I had heard from the cab of the tower and from underneath the equipment shed. The same broad, patient respiration that had come from the ground while the clearing was being transformed. I stood up and looked at the pine trees around the well. They were identical to every other tree in the plantation, same species, same age, same spacing. But within about a 20-foot radius of the wellhead, the ground was subtly different. The needle duff was thinner, almost absent in places, and the exposed soil had a faint darkish cast, the same color I'd seen in the clearing at night. The trees, at the very edge of this radius, 3 of them had a slight lean, maybe 2 or 3 degrees off vertical, tilting outward from the well as though the ground beneath their root plates had shifted. I did not touch the well cap again. I did not try to open it. I marked the GPS coordinates, walked back to my truck, and drove to Lufkin. The repeater continued to fail intermittently through August and into September. I documented 7 more outages from the remote data loggers I'd left at the site. Each one followed the same pattern. Broadband noise onset near sunset, repeater failure within an hour, recovery between 1:30 and 3 a.m. The outages were not nightly. They occurred in clusters 3 or 4 consecutive nights, then a gap of 5 or 6 days, then another cluster. I submitted a report to Dale, recommending that the county relocate the repeater to an alternative site. I cited chronic RF interference from an unidentified subsurface source and attached the spectrum analyzer captures, the thermal data, the GPR survey, and a cost estimate for a new tower installation at a site 9 miles west that I had already scouted. Dale approved it. The county commissioners approved the funding in October. We decommissioned Tower 14 as a repeater site in November. The new repeater has been operating without incident. I never went back to Tower 14 at night. I filed a report with the Texas Railroad Commission regarding the potentially unplugged exploratory well, citing the thermal anomaly and requesting a plugging verification inspection. The commission acknowledged receipt. 7 months later, I received a letter stating that the well had been referred to their orphan well program for evaluation. As of the last time I checked, it was still in the queue. I've been told there are roughly 8,000 orphan wells in Texas awaiting evaluation. The queue moves slowly. I want to be clear about what I think happened and what I don't know. I think the 1958 exploratory well was improperly plugged, or its plug has failed over time. I think something is moving through that well bore from depth gas, fluid, thermal energy, some combination, and dispersing laterally through the soil at the depth the GPR identified. I think this process is cyclical, probably driven by pressure or temperature differentials that follow a diurnal pattern. And I think the energy it releases is sufficient to produce measurable electromagnetic interference, soil displacement, and thermal effects at the surface. I think the phenomenon is intensifying. The repeater outages were getting longer over the 3 weeks before I was sent. My overnight observations documented physical changes to the clearing that I had not seen during my 2 prior daytime visits over the preceding 2 years. Something is changing at that site, on a time scale of months or years, and the only monitoring it was receiving has been removed. What I don't know is why the energy is strongest at night, why it follows the precise rhythm that it does, and why, when I stood by that wellhead at noon on a calm day and listened, the sound I heard was not the hiss of escaping gas or the gurgle of moving fluid. It was not mechanical. It was not random. It was a rhythm that I recognized because I'd already heard it. And I recognized it the way you recognize a person's breathing, not by its frequency or its volume, but by its character, its identity. The sense that what you are hearing is not a process, but a behavior. I don't have a measurement for that. I don't have a diagnostic for the difference between a geological process that happens to be rhythmic and something beneath the ground that breathes because it is alive. My instruments recorded energy and heat. They did not record intent. And I'm a technician, not a geophysicist, not a biologist, not a person qualified to speculate about what lives at 4,000 feet beneath the East Texas coastal plain. But I will say this. On the night I stayed at Tower 14, when the clearing changed and the tower warmed and the ground opened itself like something turning over in sleep, the 3 rangers who had come before me and left before sunrise were not wrong to leave. They were not cowards. They were people who felt something that their reports could not contain and made a rational decision to remove themselves from proximity to it. I stayed because I had instruments and because Dale needed data, and because I'm stubborn in a way that has served me professionally and failed me in every other area of my life. I stayed and I measured, and I brought the data back, and the data got the repeater moved, and the repeater works fine now at its new location 9 miles west. And the well is still there, and the tower is still there, and whatever is underneath them is still following its rhythm, and no one is measuring it. And the queue moves slowly, and the trees lean a little more each year. I drove past the turnoff for the access road last month on my way to a different site. I didn't stop. My truck's thermometer read 97 degrees. When I passed the turnoff, it ticked up to 99 for about 10 seconds, then settled back. Probably the asphalt. Probably just the road surface holding the afternoon heat differently at that stretch. Probably.